When we think of the atomic bomb, one image comes to mind: Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. But what if those weren't the only intended targets? What if they were merely the first in a longer list, one that spanned continents, crossed oceans, and included cities most people would never suspect, hidden in declassified archives, forgotten military plans, and the whispers of those who once held launch codes, lies a chilling reality. The United States had nuclear targets far beyond Japan, from the icy plains of Siberia to the deserts of the Middle East, from bustling Asian metropolises to the very heart of Europe. Some of the world's most unexpected places once stood on the brink of atomic fire. In this video, we uncover the nuclear targets they never told you about, the ones erased from textbooks, redacted from documents, and buried beneath decades of secrecy. This is not just a history lesson. It's a reminder of how close the world came to a different kind of ending. The origins of target planning. Beyond Japan. As early as 1943, while the Manhattan Project was still in its most secretive stages, conversations within the U.S. military and government hinted at a broader scope for atomic deployment. The Target Committee, a group convened to evaluate potential sites for atomic bombing, initially focused on Japan. However, transcripts from meetings held at Los Alamos reveal discussions that suggest nuclear strategy was already being imagined in a more global context. General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, was not just concerned with ending World War II. He was also thinking about post-war American dominance. As he coordinated bomb construction and delivery logistics, he commissioned intelligence on the industrial capabilities of potential post-war adversaries, especially the Soviet Union and Germany. Even though Nazi Germany was collapsing by mid-1945, there was a persistent fear that remnants of Axis power or new ideological enemies might require future atomic deterrence. Some of the earliest secret memos list not only Japanese cities like Kyoto and Kokura, but also major cities in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Scholars believe that had the war continued, or had political conditions evolved differently, the bomb might have been deployed elsewhere. Germany was once a candidate. Germany, surprisingly, was not off the table for long. Despite its surrender in May 1945, early planning documents from as far back as 1944 included German cities on atomic target lists. Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were all identified as high-value industrial or psychological targets. One internal memo even proposed a demonstration strike on a German city to break civilian morale. Had Germany resisted longer, but timing played a critical role. The atomic bomb wasn't ready before Germany's surrender. Yet, the existence of such lists reveals a sobering truth. If the war in Europe had lasted even a few months longer, Germany could have faced the same fiery fate as Hiroshima. What's even more chilling is the idea that the U.S. had no moral pause about using the bomb in Europe. The primary calculation was military effectiveness and strategic impact, not humanitarian consequence. The same scientific community that debated whether to warn Japan before the bombing had considered Europe with even less hesitation. That historical reality adds complexity to the often simplified narrative of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, being unique decisions. The Soviet Union and Cold War thinking after Japan's surrender. Nuclear planning didn't stop, it escalated. As tensions with the Soviet Union began to rise, American military strategists rapidly adapted atomic policy for a new geopolitical landscape. Operation Dropshot, a 1949 military contingency plan, mapped out 66 cities in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc as potential atomic targets. Moscow, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Kiev, and Warsaw were among the cities that would have been hit in a first strike scenario. These were not defensive contingencies. They were offensive blueprints meant to cripple Soviet command structures and industrial centers in one massive blow. Some of the plans were so detailed that they included estimates of civilian casualties, projected fallout patterns, and even the expected timeline for Soviet collapse after a preemptive strike. The logic was brutal. Destroy the ability to retaliate before the enemy could respond. Declassified documents from the 1950s show how the U.S. Air Force practiced nuclear delivery routes over Europe, simulating bombing runs that mirrored paths to Soviet cities. Entire squadrons trained for missions that, had they been activated, could have plunged the world into immediate nuclear holocaust. The Middle East, oil and atomic strategy, while Europe and Asia were at the forefront of nuclear planning. Documents from the Eisenhower era reveal another dimension, the Middle East. In a 1958 National Security Council briefing, an advisor suggested that in the event of Soviet incursion into oil fields of Iran or Saudi Arabia, nuclear options must be considered. Why the Middle East oil? Strategic control over petroleum was essential to Western economic and military stability. If these regions were occupied or destabilized by Soviet proxies or uprisings, atomic bombs were seen as tools not only of deterrence, but of tactical enforcement. Declassified files from Operation Troy and Operation Vulcan, now only partially unredacted, show that the U.S. considered strikes on oil hubs like Abadan in Iran or Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia. These were not simply retaliatory concepts. They were options to prevent critical resource denial. Nuclear use in deserts was also viewed as more containable. Without dense populations, some military planners argued, the fallout would be minimal and the geopolitical signal would be maximized. It was the post-Hiroshima world had entered uncharted territory. For the first time in history, humanity had a weapon capable not just of winning wars, but of shaping the very behavior of nations through sheer existential fear. It's in this context that American planners, politicians, and scientists began to entertain nuclear use as a policy tool, not simply to end a war, but to sculpt a geopolitical order. In numerous memoranda between 1945 and 1950, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff repeatedly discussed potential targets of opportunity in Eastern Europe and Asia. These weren't random brainstorms. They were methodical evaluations with statistical risk models, supply chain impact charts, and casualty projections. A previously classified Pentagon document titled Evaluation of Strategic Atomic Targets in Eurasia outlines how infrastructure in cities like Warsaw, Bucharest, and Sofia was mapped for potential obliteration. Each entry listed industrial significance, estimated fallout drift, and even psychological impact. This wasn't just militaristic ambition, it was ideological insurance. American leadership feared that the collapse of Axis powers would create a power vacuum ripe for Soviet and communist expansion. The nuclear bomb became the deterrent of choice. Henry Kissinger, in his early academic writings before becoming National Security Advisor, even speculated that the threat of using atomic weapons could cement diplomatic arrangements more effectively than signed treaties. The United Kingdom, America's closest ally, wasn't exempt from nuclear strategizing either. While never listed as a direct target, contingency scenarios envisioned a world in which Britain might fall to communist revolution or be overtaken by Soviet influence. In such an event, the U.S. had to be prepared. A now unsealed National Intelligence Estimate from 1952 explored what a hostile Western Europe might look like and how nuclear assets stationed in Greenland, Iceland, and even North Africa could be repositioned to respond. It wasn't all theoretical. By 1955, the U had deployed the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, a comprehensive and frightening document that outlined full-scale nuclear attacks against hundreds of cities globally. Many of these targets were in non-aligned nations or former colonies that had not taken sides in the Cold War, but were deemed potentially unstable. The logic a country's neutrality was no guarantee of future safety. Take India, for instance. During its early years of independence, India tried to maintain a non-aligned stance, resisting pressure from both Washington and Moscow. But American strategic thinkers didn't see neutrality as comforting. They saw it as unpredictable. A 1958 Rand Corporation report categorized India as a swing nation, potentially dangerous due to its refusal to conform. Theoretical strike plans were created for major Indian industrial hubs, should the political tides shift. In Latin America, several countries were similarly flagged for what military analysts called contingency targeting. Countries like Cuba, even before the missile crisis, Argentina, and even Brazil found themselves the subject of speculative nuclear planning. U.S. intelligence feared that these regions could become breeding grounds for Soviet influence, revolution, or anti-American sentiment. Documents suggest that officials were particularly concerned about any nation with a growing labor movement or nationalist leadership. Africa, largely seen by Cold War strategists as a chessboard for influence, was not spared either. As European colonial powers began to retreat, newly independent nations like the Congo, Algeria, and Egypt were seen as unpredictable elements. U.S. intelligence feared Soviet-backed regimes gaining control of critical resources, especially uranium, oil, and strategic ports. Several now declassified reports from the CIA and Department of Defense in the early 1960s discussed the viability of preemptive deterrence in African regions deemed susceptible to communist coups. It's easy, in hindsight, to dismiss these strategies as paranoid. But at the time, American officials truly believed they were preserving peace by preparing for every conceivable conflict. The philosophy was chilling readiness through omnipresent threat. The U.S. did not need to launch these strikes to make them effective. Merely having the plans in place sent a message. Indeed, this reliance on nuclear contingency shaped entire generations of defense infrastructure. Air bases were constructed in remote locations not just for potential Soviet engagement, but for global reach. Alaska, Guam, Diego Garcia, and even secret installations in Turkey and Libya were selected in part because of their access to a wide target grid. Pilots trained for dead-hand missions flights that, once launched, would proceed to their targets even if communication with headquarters was severed. Nuclear submarines began patrolling oceans not just as deterrents, but as movable launch platforms capable of striking unexpected targets. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of this strategy was the calculated psychological component. Targeting decisions weren't always about population size or industrial value. Sometimes they were about symbolism. Destroying a cultural capital, a religious center, or a city with historical resonance could send a more terrifying message than striking a weapons facility. A 1954 Air Force document called Psychological Prioritization in Atomic Targeting openly discusses the impact of striking cities that embody national identity, even if they held no military significance. This cold rationality extended into allied relationships as well. NATO partners like France, Italy, and the Netherlands were reassured on the surface, but included in nuclear planning contingencies behind closed doors. U.S. policy maintained that if a European ally was compromised, plans for nuclear retribution or containment must be ready, even if it meant striking within Allied borders. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the sheer number of potential nuclear targets on American planning documents had expanded into the thousands. Not all were prioritized equally, but the fact that so many cities and regions, many outside of traditional conflict zones, were considered reveals the breadth and depth of U.S. strategic nuclear thinking. It was less about reacting to war and more about preventing one through carefully curated fear. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of it all. For every bomb that was never dropped, there were countless maps drawn, simulations run, and strike orders rehearsed. The silence of history is not the absence of intent, but often the result of invisible restraint or lucky circumstance. Continuation, the shadows of nuclear intent, the forgotten targets, in the shadows of victory. American military planners had turned their attention toward a larger, more systemic goal, ensuring dominance in the post-war order. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of psychological and geopolitical leverage, and that meant developing a comprehensive strategy for potential use not only in Japan, but across a world still in flux. Germany, the nuclear alternative that never came. One of the most surprising revelations to come out of declassified documents is the extent to which Nazi Germany had once been considered a possible atomic target. While Germany surrendered in May 1945, months before the atomic bombs were ready, the momentum of US's nuclear development had not excluded the possibility that, if the bombs had come online earlier, Berlin, Hamburg, or Munich could have been targets. In fact, early iterations of the Manhattan Project in the 1942-43 period were explicitly motivated by the fear that Hitler's Germany was also working on an atomic bomb. In that climate, preemptive nuclear strikes on key German industrial cities were not just contemplated, they were modeled. Had the war in Europe persisted just a few months longer, the world might have seen atomic devastation not in the Pacific, but in the heart of Europe. That prospect was narrowly averted by the swift collapse of Nazi forces, but the target maps drawn up remain a sobering reminder of how close Germany came to being ground zero. Korea, a forgotten frontier. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the world shifted from global war to Cold War, and once again, the specter of nuclear weapons returned, this time in the Korean peninsula. During the Korean War, 1950-1953, President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur both considered the use of atomic bombs against North Korea and even parts of China. Documents from the era reveal that up to 26 potential nuclear targets were proposed across North Korea, including Pyongyang, Wonsan, and Hamhung. The rationale: to break the North's will, disrupt Chinese support, and end the war swiftly. One Pentagon memo even stated that an appropriate number of atomic bombs would be utilized if conventional warfare failed. Thankfully, these weapons were never deployed, but their very inclusion in tactical plans demonstrates how normalized the concept of tactical nuclear use had become within a few short years of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Vietnam, a quiet contingency. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, and the nuclear question once again crept into strategic discussions. Though rarely spoken of in public, several American officials, most notably during the Tet Offensive of 1968, considered the feasibility of deploying low-yield tactical nuclear weapons in remote jungle areas to destroy enemy supply lines or underground tunnel systems. One of the more chilling proposals was code-named Operation Duck Hook, a plan under President Nixon that involved the possible use of nuclear weapons if peace talks with North Vietnam stalled. Targets would have included military infrastructure along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and potentially strategic areas in Laos and Cambodia. Although the plan was ultimately shelved due to fears of international backlash and escalation with the Soviet Union, the documents were never destroyed, and now, decades later, they serve as a stark reminder that the line between conventional and nuclear warfare was far more porous than many believe. China, the borderline, flashpoint. During the 1958 Taiwan Strait Crisis, U.S. military leaders drew up plans to use atomic bombs against mainland China in the event of a full-scale invasion of Taiwan or continued shelling of the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. A declassified Air Force report from that period outlined a series of tactical nuclear strikes on Chinese coastal cities, industrial hubs, and military installations. The targets included Xiamen, Guangzhou, and the outskirts of Shanghai locations teeming with civilian populations. President Eisenhower, to his credit, refrained from authorizing these attacks, but the willingness of top brass to propose such strikes just 13 years after Hiroshima reveals the hair-trigger nature of Cold War brinkmanship. The Middle East oil, influence, and containment. Perhaps the most obscure set of nuclear plans involved the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Iran, and Syria, during periods of heightened tension. In the 1970s and 80s, during the height of the Cold War, the Pentagon developed strategic contingency plans that included the possibility of using nuclear weapons to protect oil infrastructure or to halt the spread of Soviet-aligned regimes. While never officially disclosed at the time, files uncovered through FOIA requests suggest that nuclear strikes on Baghdad or Tehran were not beyond the realm of possibility in certain scenarios, especially if those nations had moved toward acquiring nuclear weapons themselves or threatened the oil supply chain. One particularly unnerving plan, titled Operation Gallant Phoenix, envisioned a scenario where U.S. forces would neutralize multiple Middle Eastern capitals using low-yield atomic devices as a last resort. The existence of such contingency strategies paints a picture of American foreign policy far more aggressive and prepared for escalation than previously believed. Canada and the UK, an internal nuclear dilemma. Not all nuclear target maps involved enemies. One of the strangest and most controversial sets of targets includes areas in Canada and even the United Kingdom. These weren't attack targets per se, but rather denial targets, locations that, in the event of Soviet occupation, would be destroyed by forces to prevent their use by an enemy. In this context, cities like Halifax, Glasgow, and Liverpool were discussed as sites of potential preemptive strikes, should Allied territory fall into hostile hands. It's a chilling concept, the possibility that the U.S. would bomb its own allies rather than allow vital ports or airfields to be used against them. Yet it underscores how deeply embedded nuclear logic had become in military doctrine, one where strategic calculation sometimes eclipsed human cost. Conclusion: a legacy of secrets and silence. The official narrative of America's atomic legacy is one of necessity, defense, and reluctant use. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were portrayed as singular events, never to be repeated. But the documents and strategies that have since come to light tell a different story, a story of preparation, possibility, and peril across the globe. From Berlin to Baghdad, from Hanoi to Halifax, the United States quietly mapped out a nuclear future far more expansive than most citizens ever knew. While many of these plans were never enacted, the mere existence of such detailed targeting portfolios speaks volumes about the mindset of the era. These were not merely weapons of last resort. They were tools of global posturing, components of diplomatic theater, and silent enforcers of a fragile peace built on fear. And perhaps that is the most haunting secret of all, not just where the bombs could have fallen, but how easily the threshold might have been crossed. The post-Cold War era shadows that linger. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the global threat of nuclear war appeared to recede. The bipolar standoff that had justified much of the United States' vast nuclear targeting apparatus faded. Yet, as archives slowly declassified, it became clear that the nuclear shadow had not lifted. It had simply moved into more covert, flexible, and less visible forms. In the 1990s and early 2000s, new nuclear targeting strategies, often grouped under the term adaptive planning, were developed. These involved modular target sets that could be quickly activated depending on emerging threats. Some of the most surprising inclusions in these plans were non-nuclear states, often in regions undergoing political instability or suspected of developing weapons of mass destruction. Libya a near miss in the desert under Muammar Gaddafi. Libya was a persistent concern for American planners. In the early 2000s, intelligence agencies assessed that Libya was pursuing nuclear ambitions in cooperation with the Afghan network in Pakistan. As part of the Pentagon's updated Conplan 8022, a nuclear contingency plan designed for preemptive strikes, Tripoli was included as a potential target. though Gaddafi eventually abandoned his nuclear program and permitted inspections. Leaked memos from the Bush administration suggest that military planners were prepared to use low-yield nuclear bunker busters against suspected underground facilities in Libya if diplomacy failed. The implications are stark, even after the Cold War. Nuclear weapons remained not only a deterrent, but also an option under active consideration for rogue states, even those lacking atomic arsenals. Pakistan, the unspoken fear, perhaps one of the most sensitive subjects in U. Nuclear planning involves Pakistan, a nuclear-armed country with a volatile political environment and a history of internal instability. Although a nominal ally in the war on terror, Pakistan's nuclear arsenal has long been a source of quiet alarm in Washington. In 2001, and again in 2008 after periods of political turmoil, contingency plans were drafted by STRATCOM United States Strategic Command to secure or neutralize Pakistan's nuclear stockpiles in the event of a radical Islamist takeover or civil war. Some of these plans, according to investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, included surgical nuclear strikes on depots believed to store fissile material or launch systems aimed not at enemies, but at keeping such weapons from falling into the wrong hands. It's a troubling paradox. The United States prepared nuclear responses to prevent nuclear threats, potentially making the very scenario they sought to avoid more likely. Cyber war and nuclear escalation, the invisible trigger. In the 2010s, as cyber capabilities expanded, so did the risk of accidental or unauthorized nuclear escalation. What was once triggered by missiles and tanks could now be initiated by lines of code. Defense documents from the era outline scenarios where cyber attacks on early warning systems or command and control networks might be interpreted as acts of war, justifying nuclear retaliation. Several target simulations were created, including digital strike-back protocols against nation-states suspected of launching cyber attacks on the U.S. power grid or military satellites. Nations like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea became core suspects in these hypothetical operations, and nuclear targeting plans were quietly adapted to incorporate these new dimensions. Here, the nuclear threat is no longer just physical, it's systemic, embedded in data flows, and designed to trigger rapid responses that could escalate before diplomacy even begins. The expansion of tactical nukes. In recent years, the U.S. has renewed emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons, including low-yield warheads like the W-76-2, designed for submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Unlike strategic warheads meant to obliterate cities, these smaller devices are built for battlefield, use a shift that blurs the once clear line between conventional and nuclear war. As part of this shift, new targeting portfolios have been proposed, covering North Korea, Iran, Syria, and even Venezuela in theoretical conflicts involving U.S. troops abroad. In one Pentagon simulation leaked in 2018, a scenario titled Rogue Dawn envisioned a joint U.S. NATO operation where tactical nuclear strikes were authorized on anti-air batteries near Tehran and a naval base in Bandar Abbas. These aren't Cold War relics. They are 21st century blueprints, drawn up in conference rooms, designed for rapid deployment, and calibrated for acceptable levels of destruction. A culture of silence. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of America's nuclear strategy is its opacity. Despite occasional leaks, Freedom of Information Act requests, and declassified documents, vast portions of a nuclear doctrine remain inaccessible to the public. Former insiders like Daniel Ellsberg, who released parts of the Pentagon Papers and later revealed secret nuclear strategies in his book, The Doomsday Machine, described an entrenched culture of secrecy, where even presidents were occasionally kept in the dark about the full scope of targeting plans. This secrecy is by design. A full reckoning with the breadth of potential targets many in populated, non-nuclear nations might provoke international outrage, domestic dissent, or worse, a re-evaluation of American moral authority. The paradox is haunting. To prevent nuclear war, the U.S. built a system that could wage it anywhere, at any time, and for decades. Much of the world remained unaware of just how close they came to being next. Final reflection: who holds the trigger now? As we sit in a world of AI algorithms, hypersonic missiles, and cyber weapons, the question is not just where the bombs might fall, but who decides when. The President of the United States retains sole authority to launch a nuclear strike without congressional approval. In theory, this means one person under immense pressure, amid chaotic signals, can decide the fate of millions. And while the Cold War may be over, the launch codes are still active, the submarines are still patrolling, the bombers are still in rotation. The silence is not peace, it is preparation, paused. So the next time you see a map, remember there are layers we don't see, zones not shaded in red, but in silence. Not because they were never targets, but because someone decided you didn't need to know.